There's a strange paradox in how we perceive reality, especially when examining the architectural legacy left to us from previous centuries. If you strip away the familiar labels and examine the majestic structures of the 19th century, with the unbiased perspective of an engineer rather than a historian, an image emerges that doesn't fit the official narrative of civilization's development at all. We're conditioned to regard numerous domed buildings crowned with towering spires exclusively as religious structures, places designed for prayer and spiritual ritual. But if you actually compare their design features with modern industrial facilities, the resemblance becomes so unmistakable that dismissing it as coincidence requires deliberate effort. The form of these buildings, saturated with complex geometric elements, metal finials, and domes covered with highly conductive materials like copper or gold, triggers immediate associations with technical apparatus. These aren't merely decorative choices, they're functional schematics. Compare these ancient temples with modern transformer stations, generators, or wireless transmission installations. You'll notice an identical structural principle. Spires topped with intricate metal constructions strikingly resemble antennas and resonators specifically designed to receive and transmit electromagnetic signals. Regardless of what denomination the building is officially attributed to, whether a Christian cathedral, a Muslim mosque, or another religious structure, the upper portion is invariably executed according to a single technical standard, as if following a universal blueprint for power infrastructure, adapted to local aesthetic preferences. Why do we so stubbornly refuse to recognize the technology staring us in the face? The answer lies in a phenomenon that can be called habituation blindness. From earliest childhood through school textbooks and cultural conditioning, an unbreakable axiom becomes embedded in our consciousness. This is a temple. It was built for worship. When an idea takes root at the subconscious level, the brain stops critically analyzing incoming visual information. We look at a complex engineering structure, perfectly designed to accumulate and distribute atmospheric electricity, and we see only a symbol of faith. If an identical object studded with spires and metallic grids were presented to someone without historical context, say on the grounds of a decommissioned industrial facility or scientific research station, the immediate assumption would be that it served energy generation or communication purposes. No one would suggest it was purely decorative. But place that same structure in the 1800s and critical thinking shuts down entirely, yielding to learned dogma. This global misconception persists because any deviation from accepted narrative is perceived as error. History preserved in textbooks is treated as absolute truth, even when it contradicts basic physics and logic. We're told that architects of the past expended colossal resources creating elaborate metal antenna arrays solely for aesthetic beauty and spiritual inspiration. And we accept this explanation, ignoring the fundamental principle that functionality in architecture always takes precedence over form. But if we acknowledge, even momentarily, that these buildings actually served as elements of a global energy distribution network, a logical question immediately arises about the transmission methods for this power. After all, if these enormous stations generated or collected electricity, how was it delivered to end users? In our familiar understanding of the world, electricity is inseparably linked with wires, cables, and utility poles, entangling cities in metallic webs. However, careful study of urban landscapes from that era reveals a surprising detail that completely overturns conventional understanding of the technological infrastructure of the past. The complete absence of the wire networks we consider essential, despite clear evidence of technologies requiring substantial energy. Detailed examination of the chronology of urban utilities reveals a striking anomaly that official historiography prefers to ignore entirely. If you trace the evolution of urban landscapes throughout the 19th century, you can observe a sharp and unnatural transition. The sudden appearance of massive quantities of cables and poles that literally shrouded cities in chaotic webs after a specific historical moment. Before this threshold, according to archival evidence, the urban environment was remarkably clean and free of overhead wiring, yet demonstrably technologically sophisticated. This stark contrast suggests that the widespread introduction of wired networks wasn't evolutionary progress, but rather regression, a forced compromise implemented after the loss of superior technology. This contradiction becomes particularly evident in the history of public transportation. There, exists irrefutable photographic evidence of tram systems operating without any visible power source. Rail vehicles moved through city streets, neither pulled by horses nor equipped with steam boilers that would inevitably produce conspicuous clouds of smoke and steam. Even more remarkably, there were no overhead contact wires above these vehicles, nothing resembling the trolley systems we're familiar with today. The battery hypothesis for that era doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Batteries of the period would have been so massive and heavy, they'd have consumed half the usable interior volume of each car, and required lengthy charging intervals that would have made commercial operation completely impractical. Nevertheless, these vehicles appear sleek and maneuverable in photographs, as if drawing energy directly from the atmosphere itself. But then something inexplicable occurs. Instead of developing and refining this technology, the world appears to slide backward into primitiveness. Horse-drawn trams suddenly appear on streets, crude carriages that struggling animals dragged along rails with visible difficulty. Later, they're replaced by electric trams, but now these vehicles are tethered to overhead wires like prisoners on leashes. It's difficult to imagine that a civilization possessing the technology for wireless propulsion would voluntarily abandon it in favor of manure-covered streets or expensive infrastructure networks made of copper wire and wooden poles. The more logical conclusion is that the technology was lost or deliberately suppressed. This leads us to the concept of atmospheric electricity, energy that permeated the environment, freely available at any location where appropriate resonators stood, those very domed structures we've been trained to see as houses of worship. Most likely, the fact that this energy was free and unmetered became the precise reason for its disappearance. At some point, a global paradigm shift in resource management occurred. Wireless electricity cannot be quantified. You cannot install a meter on ambient energy and invoice consumers for usage. A comprehensive reset of civilization took place during which efficient, fuel-independent technologies were systematically replaced by primitive yet commercially profitable alternatives. Coal, petroleum, and copper wiring enabled the creation of a dependency system where every kilowatt carries a price tag. The magnificent energy stations of the past were disconnected from atmospheric sources, their true functionality deliberately forgotten, and the buildings themselves repurposed as religious institutions. Populations were told that the antenna arrays were merely decorative flourishes and that energy could only be transmitted through physical cables. Society accepted these new parameters, and memory of the wireless era was erased within just a few generations, leaving only vague unease when examining old engravings and photographs. But if we acknowledge that past technologies exceeded our own, the question inevitably emerges about the creators of this world. The architecture itself, the legacy left to us with its proportions and sheer scale, unambiguously suggests it was designed not for people of modern physical dimensions, but for beings considerably larger. The architectural landscape preserved in historic centers of most major cities worldwide contains silent yet irrefutable evidence of another, more physically imposing civilization. If we approach building analysis from perspectives of ergonomics and basic economic efficiency, the parameters of structures from the 18th and 19th centuries provoke profound confusion. Modern humanity, with average heights and pragmatic resource management, builds very differently. We construct functional boxes with ceiling heights of 2.5 meters to minimize both construction costs and, critically, heating expenses. Heating unnecessary air volume represents unacceptable waste. However, buildings from the past that we casually label as antique or colonial style completely disregard these principles, as if their creators faced no resource constraints whatsoever or possessed entirely different physical proportions. Gigantic entrance facades, doors 4 or 5 meters in height, massive handles positioned at uncomfortable elevations for us, steps that require concentrated effort to climb without losing breath. All of this indicates these structures were not designed for us. They were built by beings of different scale and built for themselves. In these palaces and cathedrals, a modern person feels diminished and insignificant, like a child wearing oversized adult clothing. Enormous arched openings and cyclopean columns serve no functional purpose for people of our stature. For us, they represent excess capacity. This forces consideration that we inhabit ruins left by a race of giants or a civilization whose physical capabilities and technological sophistication exceeded ours by orders of magnitude. We merely adapted these majestic halls to our modest requirements, subdividing vast spaces with temporary partitions into cramped rooms and installing dropped ceilings to retain at least minimal warmth. Even more striking is the geographic uniformity of this architecture. It makes no difference whether you're standing in St. Petersburg, Paris, Washington, Melbourne, or Buenos Aires. Everywhere, the identical architectural signature appears. The same colonnades, domes, ornamental moldings, and layout solutions. This cannot be explained through cultural exchange in an era of horse-drawn transport and wind-powered sailing vessels. Such consistency indicates the existence of a unified world authority, a global empire with centralized construction standards that encompassed all continents. Alternative researchers often identify this civilization, systematically erased from collective memory, as Tartaria. It was a world without borders in the modern political sense, where a singular engineering and cultural tradition erected cities according to the standardized templates, regardless of climate zones or geographic remoteness. We behave exactly like new tenants who've moved into a dwelling they didn't construct. We utilize infrastructure whose underlying principles we don't fully comprehend and admire. Craftsmanship we cannot replicate with current capabilities. Official science attempts to convince us that all these masterpieces were created by simple laborers, wielding chisels and hammers. People who supposedly lived in crude wooden barracks and died routinely from malnutrition and epidemic disease. But this disconnect between the alleged standard of living of the builders and the sophistication of their creations is simply too vast to accept. Skeptics might object by pointing to archival photographs from the 19th century depicting construction activities at these grand structures. Scaffolding, workers, and building debris are indeed visible in these images. However, if you examine closely the precise nature of what's actually occurring in these frames, confidence in the official narrative begins dissolving rapidly, replaced by an entirely different interpretation of events. Upon detailed examination of archival photographs from the mid to late 19th century, images officially described as documenting stages of construction in world capitals, a persistent sense of cognitive dissonance emerges. We're told we're observing a creation process, the raising of majestic buildings from bare ground upward. But if you remove the caption beneath the photograph and analyze what's actually happening from perspectives of logistics and technology, the scenario transforms radically. Instead of construction sites, you're witnessing large-scale excavation operations. People armed only with pickaxes, shovels, and wooden wheelbarrows swarm through mountains of accumulated soil surrounding already finished monumental walls. Their activity resembles efforts to liberate structures from earthen imprisonment, rather than the progressive laying of bricks and installation of structural components. Particularly suspicious is the ratio between the grandeur of the architecture and the primitiveness of tools in workers' hands. Against backdrops of cyclopean arches and columns weighing multiple tons, human figures pushing handcarts appear not as creators, but as ants inhabiting a mound abandoned by some other species. There's no heavy construction machinery visible, no cranes capable of lifting massive blocks to heights equivalent to modern 10-story buildings, no concrete mixing equipment, only mud, rough timber, and manual labor. It's impossible to imagine that these same people, lacking even elementary mechanization, designed and executed in stone the complex engineering solutions that even today require sophisticated technology. Further evidence supporting the excavation theory lies in the peculiar characteristics of lower building levels throughout many historical cities. Windows descending halfway or completely into the ground, doors that open directly into accumulated soil. All of this gets attributed to the so-called cultural layer. But cultural layers accumulate at rates of mere millimeters annually. They don't bury entire first floors within a single century. Photographs from the period frequently show deep trenches excavated along building facades, where workers are literally removing thousands of cubic meters of earth, revealing to view fully developed floors that had previously been assumed to be basements or foundations. These aren't crude foundation spaces. They're completely finished living levels with high-quality architectural detailing that were buried as consequences of some global catastrophe involving massive soil displacement or mud flows. Furthermore, many frames capture exposed underground infrastructure networks. Enormous brick-lined collectors and tunnels running beneath street levels. Their quality and state of preservation are astonishing. Who possessed the time and resources to construct these complex engineering networks? And when, if the city on the surface is supposedly only just being built according to official chronology? Obviously, these utility systems existed long before the appearance of people with shovels clearing streets. Our ancestors in the 19th century didn't create this infrastructure. They discovered it. They weren't builders but restorers and inadvertent scavengers who cleared ruins of a magnificent civilization to adapt them for their own survival. The cities were already standing there, buried and waiting to be freed from deposits of clay and sediment. Official history, unable to explain the nature of the cataclysm that buried the world, simply chose to reframe this process as brilliant construction achievement. But concealing truth sometimes requires inventing explanations that contradict not merely common sense, but fundamental laws of physics. And one such example of historical fabrication is so blatant it deserves special examination. If previous arguments could potentially be disputed by referencing lost construction techniques or exceptional ancestral skill, there exist historical precedents where the official version collides head-on with basic mathematics and physical impossibility. One of the most revealing examples of such falsification involves the famous Grand Hotel International in Barcelona. This building is celebrated as the architectural jewel of the 1888 Universal Exposition, and encyclopedias describe its technical specifications and construction timeline with undisturbed confidence. And this is precisely where the deception reaches proportions, bordering on open mockery. According to publicly available documentation, this colossal complex encompassed 5,000 square meters, consisted of 5 stories, and contained 600 rooms designed to accommodate 2,000 guests. It was a genuine palace, astounding in its luxury and monumental presence. And now for the most incredible claim. Official sources state that this giant was constructed in merely 53 days, less than 2 months. Consider these numbers carefully. This means that every single day, without weekends or interruptions, workers would have needed to complete more than 10 fully finished rooms, not including common halls, stairwells, the roof structure, and foundation work. And all of this allegedly occurred in the late 19th century, without tower cranes, power tools, ready-mixed concrete, or modern logistics networks. Anyone who has experienced even minor renovation or construction work understands the absurdity of this claim. Even with contemporary technologies, unlimited workforce, and unrestricted budget, constructing and commissioning a structure of such scale in 53 days remains physically impossible. The processes of mortar curing, plaster drying, and paint setting alone require time that cannot be compressed or accelerated beyond certain chemical limits. Yet thousands of tons of building materials would have needed transportation by horse-drawn wagons, manual lifting to upper floors, and installation of complete utility systems. If we believe historians, Barcelona's workers possess supernatural abilities, allowing them to violate established laws of physics and chemistry. Or, which seems vastly more probable, the building wasn't constructed in 53 days at all. It was simply refurbished, restored, and prepared for the exhibition opening. It was already standing there, like countless other antique structures awaiting rediscovery. But the cynicism of official historiography doesn't end there. To explain why such an architectural masterpiece hasn't survived to our present day, we're offered an explanation that strains credibility to the breaking point. The hotel was allegedly conceived from the outset as a temporary structure and was demolished just 1 year after construction, immediately following the exhibition's conclusion. Imagine the magnitude of resource expenditure, human labor investment, and financial outlay necessary to erect a stone 5-story palace containing 600 rooms. And all of this supposedly undertaken with the express intention of reducing it to construction rubble 12 months later. This represents economic self-destruction that no rational investor could justify under any circumstances. Temporary structures are built from timber and lightweight panels, not from stone and brick as in imperial architectural style. Most likely, the demolition represented deliberate destruction of evidence. The building probably contained remnants of previous technologies incompatible with the new historical narrative being constructed, or its condition after excavation was sufficiently compromised that maintaining appearances long-term proved impossible. Historians simply invented a convenient fiction about record construction times and temporary designation to preemptively close uncomfortable lines of inquiry. Such inconsistencies pervade the historical record once you begin checking claims with calculator in hand. This represents open demonstration that our past was rewritten with extraordinarily broad strokes. However, beneath these visible contradictions lies an even deeper layer of concealed information. In classified archives, documents are preserved that not only confirm suspicions about historical substitution, but reveal disturbing details about precisely what occurred to our world. Assembling the scattered fragments of this mosaic, from the peculiar antennas crowning cathedral domes to buried ground floors and physically impossible construction timelines, we inevitably arrive at a frightening yet logical conclusion. All these inconsistencies aren't random chronicler errors or architectural oddities. They're systematic traces of global falsification designed to conceal the fact of catastrophic civilizational reset that occurred during the mid-19th century. The world described in our textbooks is artificial scenery erected atop ruins of a far more advanced and harmonious society. We inhabit a post-apocalyptic era without even suspecting it because memory of the Golden Age was intentionally erased and replaced with substitute narratives of wars and revolutions that merely mask the process of world division by emerging power structures. The theory of 19th century catastrophe explains the sudden technological regression where wireless technologies and atmospheric electricity systems were abandoned, and humanity was forcibly converted to dependence on hydrocarbon energy sources. But where can documentary confirmation be found if all public libraries were systematically purged? The truth, as frequently occurs, didn't disappear without trace. It was securely hidden beneath top-secret classification stamps. Intelligence agencies of leading world powers have accumulated information over decades that's capable of destroying the familiar construction of reality. Declassified materials and occasionally leaked archives from organizations like the KGB contain reports that make blood run cold. In these files, documentation exists concerning archaeological expeditions encountering burial sites of humanoid remains of gigantic stature, specimens measuring 3 meters and taller. These discoveries, which official science dismisses as hoaxes or genetic anomalies, represent actual remains of those very builders of majestic antique cities whose doorways and ceiling heights seemed inexplicably oversized to us. These archives also contain information regarding the true nature of unidentified aerial phenomena. Within the context of unified ancient civilization theory, UFOs cease appearing as vessels from distant extraterrestrial civilizations and manifest in new light. Perhaps these represent surviving technologies from our predecessors or monitoring systems operated by observers overseeing the current phase of an experiment we call modern humanity. Special prominence in these classified archives belongs to materials concerning Earth's actual structure and dimensions. The legendary expeditions of Admiral Richard Byrd to Antarctica and his enigmatic diary entries describing lands beyond the ice barrier, where eternal summer supposedly reigns, continue generating fierce debate. Secret cartographic materials and reports from military aviators hint that the shape and scale of our planet may differ radically from the globe model displayed in every classroom. Perhaps we inhabit a vastly larger territory, and the continents familiar to us represent merely a segregated enclosure, isolated from the greater world by ice walls or energy barriers. All this information has been systematically filtered and concealed for decades to maintain illusions of an understandable and predictable world. The control system doesn't require people who know about free energy sources, about their magnificent origins, or about Earth's true scale. It requires obedient consumers who believe in resource scarcity and the inevitability of perpetual labor. However, the dam restraining truth has developed cracks. By comparing verifiable facts, analyzing architectural evidence, and studying leaked classified materials, we're beginning to wake from deep hypnotic conditioning. The realization that history has been comprehensively rewritten represents the first step toward reclaiming genuine freedom. Reality is vastly more complex, more fantastic, and more extraordinary than we were permitted to imagine, and the keys to this reality are already within our grasp. Now that the veil has fallen, there can be no return to former ignorance.